All right, guys. So here's your lecture to start chapter 23. Like I said in class, it's important to understand why we have to invest so much in Europe post World War II and how we are able to do it. Just looking back in terms of the end of the war, we have the Atlantic Charter that's before we get involved in the summer of 1941. And then in January of 1945, we have the Yalta Conference, in which FDR, Churchill, and Stalin meet together. And what we realize is that Stalin has been a bad faith actor. I mean, he's a totalitarian dictator, so of course he's going to be a bad faith actor. He's only going to be looking out for himself. He never declares war on Japan, until the very end. When we look at the Yalta Conference, Stalin backs off of preserving democracy, backs off of non-imperializing, and basically says, "Listen, I'm going to occupy Poland. I'm going to take over and create puppet governments, and this is the way that it's going to be." And FDR and Churchill, in order to preserve the alliance, in order to not make things worse post World War II, are going to concede a good amount. And the reason being is because there is not trust between the two sides. There is a lot of reason not to trust Stalin. In the reason why he is angry with us is no second front for a while in World War II. I mean, we're fighting the Japanese. He's not, but he wants a second front in Europe. Sacrifice our men, do whatever it takes, make it easier on the Soviets. Also, we hide the Manhattan Project from them. I mean, allies shouldn't hide information like that. And that it boils down to also that we didn't recognize his government for a decade, and very importantly, he just wants to preserve power. And this is what we see when post World War II, our foreign minister, George Kennan, writes a telegram to the to the office of the president, talking about how like the Soviet Union is different from what we have experienced in the past. Stalin's not a king. Uh, he is imperial, but it's understanding that we're not just fighting an individual, we're also looking at an ideology as well when it comes to communism. So we need to create a much more fluid plan when dealing with the Soviet Union. We'll see that throughout, in terms of all the different Cold War policies that we go through. Each president kind of has their own approach. And when we look at the post-war, a lot of it is trying to redevelop Europe because it's been completely ravaged, and then it's also looking at these countries that are susceptible to communism and to strongmen, and to try to help them, with it. That's kind of the purpose of the International Monetary Fund. That's in terms of trying to regulate currency, and the World Bank to prevent these new governments from going bankrupt. Also, having the UN to protect against imperialism and keep territorial sovereignty and integrity. When we talk about new countries, the creation of Israel, Iran is relatively new. Iraq is relatively new. Turkey is relatively new, and preventing Western imperialization there. We have these international organizations that require coordination and mostly American support in order to ensure that these new groups maintain democratic leanings. When we look at why we invest so heavily in Europe post World War II, you can see all the money that we spend. The reason why we spend all of that money is to keep these countries democratic. You see here the point 4 program on the left-hand side with the words, giving economic aid to underdeveloped countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But, what we also have is the We also have the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine that are going to heavily affect Europe. You can see where a lot of the money is going. A lot of the money is going to the United Kingdom. A lot of the money is going to France. A lot of the money is going to Germany, to Italy, to make sure that these countries that are on the border of communism stay democratic. So when we are talking about this particular situation, it is about preserving democracy. So understand how all of these things preserve democracy and why they are needed. The UN is needed to keep the Soviet Union at bay, to have a place, a neutral site that we can negotiate with them. The IMF is created to prevent bankruptcies and stabilize currencies. The World Bank to offer loans to countries in order to preserve their sovereignty and not go bankrupt. So it becomes extremely important. And we see that Germany is the iconic example of the split, because Germany has four militarization zones. The Western countries decide to combine them. France, Britain, and the United States combine their three zones into West Germany, and the Soviet Union keeps their zone. Berlin is split into two zones. So what we have is going to be a struggle to keep the western half of Berlin, especially democratic, and not fall to the Soviet Union. We can do that through the Marshall Plan. We can do that through airlifts. It's going to take desperate measures in order to keep this section of the world democratic. So that's why we have the Marshall Plan. That is why we have the Truman Doctrine. So it is a way to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into these areas to keep them democratic. We do not want them falling to communism. We do not want them falling into totalitarianism. We do not want to see the rise of fascism. That is part of what happens with the Great Depression, in which we withdraw and are isolated, is we allow the rise of fascism. We allow the rise of totalitarianism because we do not react. We abandoned Germany after World War I. We abandoned the pro-Western government in Russia post-World War I. We're going to abandon the Chinese nationalist government post-World War II. It is this threat of communism that is going to force us to become involved. That's why we give money to Western Europe. That's why we give money to Greece. That's why we give money to Turkey. We oversee where this money is going. We want to build infrastructure. We want to build up their economy, and we want to prevent them from becoming communist or totalitarian. So wherever there is a threat of communism, the U.S. is threatened. So that is why we have such a huge aid package. That is why the Secretary of State, George Marshall, is able to get his plan through, is because they want to prevent communism from spreading. They want to prevent a repeat of post-World War I. All right. So that is what is extremely important, is that this is not military aid. This is economic aid. All right. So you give money to a country and they end up spending it where? On American businesses. Because who has the ability to do a lot of the economic tools that are required? It's going to be the United States. So if our government gives money to France, and France would like to, build an industrial center, who are they going to hire? They're going to hire Americans in order to do it. Who's going to provide them with the steel? Well, probably the United States. So we are rebuilding half of the world. So when we talk about economic prosperity, the late 1940s and into the 1950s is the most prosperous time, because our government is giving billions of dollars of aid to the rest of the world to remain democratic. And that money is being reinvested into the American economy because Europeans are buying American goods. because they can't produce their own at the moment. They don't have the infrastructure in order to do so. It's going to take about a decade for them to get that infrastructure, for them to get their factories back up and running. But during that time, the United States becomes the preeminent democratic power. So that's why we see such a huge aid package passed. That's why we have the Marshall Plan. That's why we have the Truman Doctrine. We have the European Recovery Program. No cost is too much to prevent communism. So you see there, April 3rd, 1948, $5.3 billion for recovery over the following calendar year. Save Europe from the Soviets. So $12 billion spent in total. That is an enormous amount of money. And what it is it's a reinvestment in the American economy. So why doesn't the U.S. go into great debt at this time? Because taxes are high. That money that we give to Europe is reinvested into the American economy, into American businesses. So American businesses are making money hand over fist based upon their production and their sales. The supply is low and the demand stays the same. So prices are going to start naturally going up. They're making more money. Workers are increasing, having their wages increased. What we have is a situation in which the American economy is thriving in order to protect democracy. And at the same time, this fear of communism is also creating a situation in which we do not disarm. We don't demilitarize like we did after World War I. After World War I, soldiers go back to the factories. After World War II, it's like, you guys want to stay in the Army? You want to stay in the Navy? Because we have this threat of communism. So, Eisenhower at the end of the 1950s is going to warn about the military-industrial complex. But at this time, the fear and the threat of communism is so strong with Stalin in control that we are trying to do everything we can in order to prevent it from happening. That's why we pour so much money into the European economies, and that's why we signed the National Security Act to create the Pentagon. That's why we are going to create the Department of Defense to consolidate the military underneath. That's why we're going to have the National Security Council. We're going to create intelligence agencies at this time. We're going to have the CIA. We're going to have the FBI to look into domestic matters. And then we are going to create the organization that is going to combat all Soviet influence around the world. But most particularly in Europe. All right, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, unites all of these Western democratic countries against communism, against the Soviet Union. NATO is still around today, and what it does is it provides a defensive alliance against Russia. All right, that's why it's such a contention that for Ukraine to join NATO. It's considered kind of an aggressive action if NATO allows the Ukraine to join it, which is why it is so controversial. This is the first time that the United States signs a peacetime treaty to join NATO, and Eisenhower goes from the Allied commander to the NATO commander. Right? So this is a reason why the United States has military bases in Europe, particularly in Germany. As post-World War II, we want to keep an eye on communism. We want to keep an eye on the Soviets. So we are granted access to military bases in Britain, in Germany, so that way we can be present. We are also in Turkey, so that way we can be in proximity of where the communist threats are. Right? So understand why there's such a massive investment, and understand that this is going to lead to a lot of economic prosperity within the United States, as well as a lot of fear with the second Red Scare. Right? Thank you guys. Have a good weekend.